information. The breakfast clubs are events that are run by the Leadership Academy, which is a project of the Wheel, which is Ireland's National Association of Community and Voluntary Organisations, Charities and Social Enterprises. So the Leadership Academy is a project dedicated to creating spaces for leaders at all levels in the nonprofit space to access relevant upskilling resources, find spaces to engage with other people, and to access tools and opportunities to take the next step on their leadership journey, wherever their start points. So we have people from all across the sector and out of the sector in the room this morning, and at all levels, from volunteers to CEOs, and you're all really, really welcome. I am Sharon Hughes. I am the Leadership Academy Manager, and this morning's event is brought to you with my colleagues Perrine and Matthew. If you have any questions, if you contact them directly, please don't send me a chat in the meeting because I won't be able to see it. But Matthew and Perrine are on it there. So you can get started at leadersacademy.ie, or you can connect with us on LinkedIn. And thank you so much for being here this morning. The breakfast clubs are growing for every event. This has been our highest sign-up event so far. And a big part of these events is, after listening to our experts, there's the chance to network and meet other people in the sector. So halfway through, we will pop you into breakout rooms for a chat and a reflection. And the rooms have a nominated facilitator that we've identified in advance. So don't panic, you're not going to get left in a room. That's just really awkward. We won't let that happen. Do please let the gang know if you cannot go into the breakout room. Just let them know through the chat function so that we make sure there's enough people in every room. So what brought about this morning's event, which is leadership and ethics? So I was lucky enough to attend the Carmichael Governance Awards, which was hosted in Chartered Accountants Ireland last, I think it was October, November. And the keynote speech was given by Senator Tom, I've forgotten his surname, I should have remembered that. But he talked about the importance of ethics and leadership, and it really hit home. So I'm lucky enough to be in touch with Níall from Chartered Accountants Ireland, who is their ethics lead. And they've been a big support to the Leadership Academy. So I was thinking I must ask him. And at the same time, the Wheel staff are always looking out for really interesting things that are going on in the sector. And my colleague Cathy Ann sent me this amazing article written by Jane Ann about how Ireland can lead the way in confronting global inequality. And she referenced ethics in it as well. So we thought that would be a really good conversation. And lucky enough, they both agreed to speak with us and be here with us this morning. So to introduce the speakers, Jane Ann McKenna is the Chief Executive Officer of Dóchas, which is the Irish Network for International Development and Humanitarian Organisations. She has significant experience in humanitarian and emergency response. She led Médecins Sans Frontières teams in conflict and crisis affected areas, including Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. She served as a director on MSF Ireland. She's a qualified accountant with a Master's of Business Studies in International Business from UCD Smurfit Business School. And Níall Fitzgerald is the head of ethics and governance for the Chartered Accountants Ireland, a non-executive director. He's a judge actually on the Good Governance Awards for the Irish Charities and Non-Profits, a member of the Institute of Banking Teaching Facilities. And these roles involve engagement with many organisations and business leaders in areas of accounting, sustainability and ethics. He's a member of several global ethics advisory groups for the accounting profession, and he's published articles, developed training programmes and authored guides on ethics, including, which we will reference and point you to, the Chartered Accountants Ireland Ethics Quick Reference Guide, 5 Fundamental Principles, 5 Practical Steps. So that's pretty much as you're going to hear from me. I've read out your official bios, but I've spoken to you obviously offline, and you're both really involved in different ethical aspects. So could you briefly tell the audience what your own interest is in ethics and how it's part of your day-to-day lives? And if I could ask Jane Ann, if you could go first, please.
Sure. Thanks very much, Sharon, and thanks to the Wheel actually for this opportunity. And it's lovely to be invited along to speak to this. And I'm looking forward to a good session today. Yeah, I think, like as you mentioned there, I've spent a lot of my career in humanitarian work, both overseas and here in Ireland. And I think that has really kind of guided me in terms of my approach to ethics and ethical decision making. I think if you look at humanitarian organizations and the likes of MSF working in kind of highly contentious areas where there will be kind of different armed groups, there's different parties to the conflict that you need to engage with. And key to all of that is getting acceptance, getting acceptance from the community, getting acceptance from the local political actors to be able to do your work. And absolutely fundamental to that acceptance is your principles and being able to adhere to those and demonstrate those principles in real time. So obviously, and many of your participants this morning will know, many organizations have the principles of independence, impartiality, neutrality. And, one that I, come back to all the time and is very relevant even, in my work today as a CEO of Dóchas is around that like impartiality piece. It's really around that you're basing your actions on needs alone. So, you're really putting the affected, either whether that's the affected community, affected individuals, that at the center of your decision making. You're really putting them and allowing that to guide the rest of your work. And I think that is absolutely crucial, that you're not doing that under the influence of other agendas, that you're ensuring that you're independent in terms of how you act, and that you're also being perceived as being independent as well. And that's quite important. But that essentially, that the individuals that you're trying to support, that you're trying to deliver services to, that you're trying to engage with are really at the center and are of everything you do. And that also relates to, when you want to advocate and communicate around, issues that are affecting individuals. So, looking at Gaza today or looking at conflict areas, when you are trying to draw attention to the reality of suffering that is happening around the world, that you're really ensuring that you're putting the individuals that are affected at the heart of that communication, that you're not, speaking on behalf of, that you're not trying to, anticipate what they would like, but you're effectively really engaging with them at the forefront. So it's really, for me, ethics is around demonstrating principles like independence, impartiality, neutrality in practice. And then if we look, at like in my role today in Dóchas, it's slightly different, from the, based on Camden Street, not necessarily in any conflict area, but it is really around, we have our own guiding principles, let's say, of independence, and that's absolutely crucial to ensure that we're not influenced, from a political perspective, or indeed from other business interests that would influence, our willingness to advocate for what is right and what is just and what our members are calling for, because, they are, in effect, want to see the kind of, the equality and justice being applied for the people, the communities that they're working with. And it's our role to bring that to the highest level in our advocacy. And we need those principles, to do that.
Yeah, okay, that's fantastic. And I love that global overview. Níall, you work in a slightly different place. So what would be the same question to you? Like, what is your own interest in ethics and how is it part of your day-to-day life?
Yeah, I think what we have to remember is the whole accounting profession, as a profession, one of the hallmarks of the profession is a code of ethics. So what gives accountants, if you like, license, that's any accountant, not just chartered accountants, what gives them a license to operate is actually their code of ethics. They're a profession that's recognized in law. They get to give tax advice, they get to engage and sell their services to the public, to corporates. They get to sign audit reports. They kind of have a position that's relied upon. In other words, they are automatically given this trusted position, and they're only given that on the basis that they are ethical in how they conduct their business. So my lens on this is through kind of a professional stroke business ethics. And when you look at accountants, it's not just the accountants that sign audit reports or sign financial statements, etc. We've 33,000 members. A lot of our members are involved in some shape or form in the charity nonprofit sector, for example, as trustees, working in the sector, as CEOs, as volunteers, etc. And many of our members are beneficiaries of the work of the charities and nonprofit organisations. And indeed, Chartered Accountants Ireland itself is a nonprofit organisation. Or not a charity though. Then we have members that work in public sector, with members who, the vast majority of our members would work in business. So ethics plays a big part in all their roles in terms of decision making, the decisions around the deployment of capital, decisions around the allocation of human resources, decisions around sustainability. Another item you mentioned in my bio there. A lot of the decisions around sustainability, whether to invest in reducing carbon emissions, whether to invest in increasing your social impact, a lot of those investment decisions for a lot of businesses do not carry a traditional business case. In other words, this will not immediately make me money, or there's a better use for my capital that will make me money quicker than investing in these sustainability objectives. However, the sustainability case will win out. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. So that's kind of the interplay of ethics and decision making, be it investments, be it deployment of resources, deployment of capital, etc. So that's kind of the lens I look at it from, Sharon.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Níall. And Jane, you recently in Dóchas introduced a guide to ethical communications, and in the course of our conversation, this has evolved over time from in a different type. And can you talk to us about that? What triggered the need for the document, and how did it evolve for you guys over time?
Yeah, so it was actually, I think it was way back in 2006 when we first introduced a code on images and messages. And that was really around how do we represent, the communities that we support, in an ethical way. And that was kind of looking at a clear code of what to do, what not to do. And, since 2006, there has been an evolution in terms of communications, and also in terms of understanding of what is and isn't, let's say, appropriate to communicate, or particularly imagery. And I think it was when we engaged with our members around revising this code, I felt it was important that, that we weren't looking at it from a regulatory perspective, because I do fundamentally believe if you look at it from an overly regulatory perspective, you're already creating quite binary positions, within organizations, where people also might look at it from a protection perspective, saying, actually, I'm not sure if I want this other body to look at, what is right or wrong, or, how will this impact me as an organization? So actually, we decided to do quite a different approach. We obviously engaged with the members in developing the content for the ethical communications, but it was actually, we want to create a guide. We want it to be a series of commitments that members themselves are signing up to. It's a self-regulatory process. It's really saying we aspire, we want to do better. And actually, these are some of the commitments that we want to adhere to. And it's really around creating that open space, I believe, for kind of dialogue and debate. I don't think a lot of ethical decisions are not black and white. It's not, you can do this, you can't do that. And it's evolving continuously over time. So I think what's absolutely fundamental in kind of leadership is actually creating that space for dialogue, debate, different opinion, and actually, encouraging learning through that, and seeing how we can do better. And I think that is a bit more of an inclusive approach, because what we find is that, it has actually brought our members very much together around looking at how we can do better, how we can learn from best practice from each other, how we can learn from best practice, overseas or in other countries as well. And, it becomes more, there's a bit more energy around it than looking at it from have you signed your form to say, we're adhering to the guidelines? It's really much more than that. And it's creating an environment where ethics and those kind of decisions are kept alive, and that it's alive within organizations, within our membership, within Dóchas, that we are continuously questioning, debating, being open about these challenges, and that there is no one right or wrong answer. And I think even in the guide, for example, and it's available on our website, and I think it's a resource really for all, and charities, not just international charities, but we do a piece in each section around reality check. And, that's just a series of questions. It's really around, creating questions which is causing organizations to really think about how they're representing communities, what they're considering in terms of locally led content, what they're considering in terms of consent, really looking at, have the questions they need to ask themselves to be able to improve their practice in this area. Yeah.
I love what you said there about bringing people on board, and the difference between codes and guides. We'll get into that a little bit more, and also the idea that you're trying to get individual consensus, that there is no black and white. I know, Níall, you've commented on how it's different to law. I think, did you say law was first? I'm not going to take your punchline. I'll leave it for you there. But you basically were responsible for the Chartered Accountants Ireland for their code of ethics and governance for our sector. So can you outline how that work came about for you and how you have found it evolved?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more there with Jen Ann in terms of what ethics is about. First and foremost, is creating the time to reflect and actually consider what the issue is at hand. And I think a lot of ethical dilemmas arise because of time pressures or because of lack of awareness that or even acknowledgement that you actually are in an ethical dilemma. And you mentioned the law, Sharon, and I'll park that comment for a minute and I'll bring it back in. But I'll talk about regulation for a second. Like, accountancy as a profession is very heavily regulated. Hence why they created a position in Chartered Accountants Ireland called Head of Ethics and Governance, because there's so much regulation. And if you start following the letter of the law, laws for politics, laws about policies, and that's about groups, and group in terms of countries, group in terms of European Union, geographical areas, whatever. So when we start talking about the law, we're talking about kind of group decisions, what's in the best interest of everybody, okay? Whereas ethics is about an individual. That's your values, what you're about, and then how that interacts with other people's values or other organizations' values, okay? And that's wherein dilemmas arise. It's not with law, because everybody will kind of go, what's the law say? Let's follow the law. Of course, you'll have your exceptions to that, I get that, but the vast majority of people will go, follow the law. But ethics is a bit more complex, it's a bit more nuanced than that. And the guide you're referring to that we created was the kind of 5 practical steps, 5 fundamental principles. The 5 fundamental principles, just to park that very quickly, is part of our code of ethics, which, folks, is over 200 pages long. In my view, it's not a code of ethics, it's a code of conduct. It's very much part of our regulatory framework. When accountants are held to account by our regulators, it's normally a finding against them because they've breached something within the code of ethics rather than law, okay? So that's a big mammoth piece of documentation, stroke regulation, and it's 200 and something pages and it's growing, okay? So it's only going one way. So our members all want to be ethical, our members all want to do the right thing. So we created this little short guide that, well, I'll tell you a bit of clever engineering that we did. The brief was to design a 1-page guide for our members that makes it easier for them to kind of engage with the code of ethics. So we said the 5 fundamental principles is every accountant has to act with integrity. You have to have professional competence and due care, i.e. you need to know what you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it, you know. So don't give advice in areas you're not competent. So don't ask me anything about insolvency. I wouldn't have a clue. The confidentiality, very important. Objectivity, that's the kind of being able to see things from an independent perspective. And professional behavior. Professional behavior is kind of how you conduct yourself and conduct yourself in a manner not to discredit. Now that's tied back to the code of ethics, regulatory. But what was most valuable and got the most traction was the 5 practical steps. And they kind of go from, you know, what happens and how do you prepare yourself for when you're in an ethical dilemma. And we broke that down to 5 stages. And I'll go through just very briefly, if I may, Sharon. The first one is about know your values. You cannot start critiquing other people's values. You cannot start kind of engaging with what your issue is unless you're quite sure or have some ideas of what you stand for and what your values are. And within the guide, we kind of make reference to a few tools that help you kind of consider your values. You know, you kind of get a whole list of values, you rank them, one to, you know, pick out your top 10 or whatever, and you kind of assess yourself. And the second part of that is to consider your cognitive development. So step number 2, consider your cognitive. So how well do you engage with those values? Do you know your red lines, for example? We all have values, but at what stage will we forgo those values? So, you know, if I could be quite dramatic here, if somebody had a gun to your child's head, what would you not do? Do you know? Of course, there's probably nothing you wouldn't do. So it's just to have that real conversation with yourself. In what situation would I kind of go beyond my own values? Because that's when you're pushed and that's when you're challenged. The third step then is how do you engage in ethical discourse? Because the first and most important thing to realize is you are never alone. There's always somebody you can talk to, be it a colleague, be it a friend, be it a family member, or be it a complete stranger through some confidential helpline. But
And
to respect,
actually, Níall, I'm going to actually bring in the next question, actually, just to
yeah,
keep the conversation moving, actually, because I think
yeah,
you're going into it, and it's about why
yeah,
should organizations care about ethics. So
yeah,
I
yeah,
think what you're talking there about is the discourse, but it's also about like the space for the discourse.
yeah.
So if you can finish with, I think you're at
Oh,
3. So yeah, you
yeah.
can finish
Yeah,
with
no,
4 and 5.
sorry,
But
you're
we're,
absolutely
yeah,
right. But you don't consider that until the fifth step. The fourth step is to kind of know your influencers, because you know it's like what inspires you and stuff. But that, I'll bring that straight to step 5 then, Sharon, and that's kind of understand or characterize the culture of the organization.
Mm.
So you only begin to think about that. That's step 5, the final step. But you cannot really consider that until you've gone through your first 4 steps about yourself. Ethics is about you. Then you look at the organization, and then that's the organization's responsibility. You're absolutely right, Sharon. What did I say about trust? Trust is the currency of leadership. Money is the currency of doing business, if you like. So, you know, what you want is your organizations to have healthy organizational cultures where people are encouraged to speak up. We're not talking protected disclosures. We're just talking about speaking up, to have that discourse, to have people they can go to be listened to, no matter how extreme they might sound to you, because you might have different values, but it's kind of to respect, to listen, and to give the space. Because sometimes people, when they're in an ethical dilemma, they're super stressed, they may have mental anguish, they may not articulate themselves in a
yeah.
very coherent way, and it's to give them time to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to go back to Jane Ann, because what is so interesting is the more you kind of talk about it, how personal ethics is, and how like you're talking about, you're an accountant, Níall, but you're talking about psychological principles and philosophical principles. You're not talking about technical principles. So, Jane Ann, how do you see it as that kind of individual, not versus, but how do you weave that into an organization, and how do those two things work together?
Well, I think it's kind of it's inherent even in the topic of this conversation, in this the title really around ethical leadership, and I think it is absolutely critical, as leaders of, within your team or within an organization, that you create a culture. Like as Níall says, and I think it's interesting that we're coming from very different perspectives, but we're kind of meeting somewhere in the middle. That you're building a culture where you're really where it's clear kind of what are the agreed values of working, what are, the agreed principles that define what you do and how you do it. And, that might be different for each organization or company, but it's really around and really engaging with your team on like, what does that mean in reality? What does that mean in practice? How are we going to deliver on this? And, they often, when we were developing our strategy, for example, we spent a good bit of time on the values, and there was a list of about 15 values, I remember. And I was okay, now we have to like, is this, what's actually achievable? What's really important for us to do? And I really believe, values will guide behavior. So what are the behaviors we want to demonstrate in the next 5 years or so, and what's absolutely crucial when we look back, that we can say actually we delivered when we were doing that, we incorporate those values into it. And I think that is and building that with your team, and like what Níall said, really creating that space for discussion, debate, and I think having spent a number of years, and those who may know Medicine Sans Frontières, it's a whole it was founded with doctors and journalists, so it was an organization where I wouldn't say there was constant debate, but a lot of arguing, a lot of dissent, a lot of different opinions and voices about what should do in very heightened environments, because there was a lot at stake. There is a lot at stake in these environments. There's a lot of risk. Decisions that you make will have huge impact on communities and individuals' lives. But it really, you do find that by embodying that culture where people are open to bring forward and their perspective, and creating the right spaces to do that, because obviously this is where the whole inclusivity university comes in. How are people, what are the different ways in which people are comfortable to actually contribute to discussions, and ensuring there is those spaces created, and actually allowing then for a bit more aspiration as to what you can do and what is possible. And I think that is absolutely crucial, creating that environment. Yeah.
And then just to carry on with that, so we've talked about the individual and developing their kind of ethical standpoint and then what the organization would do. And I would ask, like, you know, obviously it's a massive question, but like, why is this so important for the sector? How can the sector embrace it? I mean, you know, you've created a guide. Why is this so important for the sector?
I think it's so important for the sector because we're in such a privileged position. We have the proximity to whether it's people who are working in Gaza at the moment, but also people who are supporting those who are homeless or those who are working drug clinics, things like that. We have the proximity to the people who are most affected by whatever we are there to support them with. So those who are the most kind of, who have been marginalized, who are not listened to, who, need additional support. And that is a very privileged position. And that's what I mean by going back to who is it that we are there to support and what is it that they want? How is what is happening to them guiding our decision making and actually being kind of, how are we actually guiding how we will kind of advocate what our principles, our values. And I think it's really around getting back to, that piece that as a sector, we're in a very privileged position. Like we are working in places, in spaces where, there are no politicians, where there are no, policymakers. We are there and it's our responsibility and our duty to be able to, to be able to advocate for and with people who are most affected, wherever they may be, internationally or here at home. And I think that is where ethics is very important, to ensure that we have at the outset very clear principles of how we're going to do that, what are some of the values that are going to embed within the organization to enable us to be able to do that in the most appropriate way and in the way that's most respectful for those who we are supporting.
Thanks. And Níall, what do you think?
Yeah, just like I see Ivan on the call there, and I know in a conversation with sustainability before, I said there's no sector that has greatest social impact in Ireland than the charity nonprofit sector. And you're dealing with the most vulnerable, you're dealing with the most kind of, if you like, dependent people that are relying on you for whatever service or whatever you're providing them with. And I mean, ethics matters everywhere, but it matters more so within the sector. And unfortunately, the sector is not properly and fully resourced. That's just a consequence of the design of the sector, if you like, and charitable organizations, etc. So it's even more important, therefore, that with the limited resources you've got, that you can control what is yourself and control the culture of the organization, control your style of leadership, and be that an ethical leadership to allow those space for conversations, to kind of embed ethics in your kind of decision making, and that goes from defining your strategy. Remember what I said, even some of the largest corporates, the PLCs, are now starting to do that. You've been doing it for decades. Some of the largest PLCs are starting to realize that your business case, the winning business case, is not always the one that gets the best return on investment of capital. Now the business case that gets the best return on social capital is starting to win investment. So, you guys have been doing that for years, you're well rehearsing it, and ethics, I think, is at the core of that.
So interesting. You're talking about the code of conduct versus the code of ethics. I think that's just a little bit, I think codes are something that the sector is very familiar with. The idea of ticking codes. Can you just unpick that a little bit more about how do you think, like, obviously you both indicated that you don't, but what are the practices that you can put in place instead of codes? Like, what are some practical tips so we would always ask people who are speaking on the Breakfast Club, could they give some advice or some, like what would be a first step or a top 3 tips that you might give to somebody who's like, actually, we need to sit down and review this for our organization or for us as individuals? Jane Ann?
Not an easy question there, Sharon, but I think probably I would like I would say, to go back and look at what are, like, if both the principles and the values, so the values really are the behavior piece, are they reflective of your organization today, and really challenge yourself to really try to actually align them with what you're doing in practice, how you're demonstrating them. And that will say, you know, are they right? Maybe they need to be evolved, maybe they need to be changed, or perhaps actually this is where we're falling down. It's not clear that we're able to demonstrate this in practice. We're not able to articulate how we're doing this in practice, and we need to actually do more. So I would say that, you know, really looking at kind of what you have in terms of your principles and values and how they're articulated within your strategy or within your planning, and seeing actually if you can't articulate how you're demonstrating them, then you need to kind of go back and say, are they right? Are they fit for purpose? Do we need to look at this? And I think if you do need to look at it, it's really crucial that you bring in the whole organization or your whole team on that, because that's the only way you'll really get buy-in of really understanding, so that you're saying when you talk about independence or when you talk about you know, accountability, that actually what that means is understood by everybody within your team, you know, what that means in practice. Now you're clearly articulating together what that looks like in reality, for your work.
Thanks, Emil. And Níall?
Yeah, I think Jane Ann has nailed it there, to be honest. I just, perhaps that's part of how you do it. I just might add external stakeholders to that, Jane Ann, is the only thing, because from Charter Accountants Ireland, we did our value statement about 4 or 5 years ago, and we didn't just speak to the staff, we spoke to regulators, we spoke to our students, we spoke to, you know, members of the community, just what do they believe accountants stand for, and what should we aspire to. So yeah, it's you have a lot of different sources to think. I think again, the sector, the charity nonprofit sector, you all have a charitable purpose. You all have a purpose, and whatever your values are would obviously align with that. And I'm gonna just say it, because you'll come up with your values and you'll have your statement. You'll paint them all over your walls and put them on all your stationery, and it'll be fantastic, and it'll be a nice reminder. But it's about living them, isn't it? And that goes back to our earlier conversation, and what measures do you put in place for your staff, for your board, for you know, for your engagement with your stakeholders? What measures you put in place to allow those values to be lived? So it's fair enough about creating time, but you know, have a look at and this is the accountant, I beg your pardon, but having a look at those policies, procedures, having a look at those codes, sorry, Sharon, those all that formal documentation, do they contradict your values in any way? Because that's what people remember. People will always want to obey the law because they don't want to lose their job, or, you know, etc., etc. So how well does your formal documentation align with the informal values, if you like? And I've seen that time and time again. Sharon, you mentioned my role as a non-exec director. I see it sometimes happening around the boardrooms, where you have passion amongst directors and you have arguments breaking out because they're both very passionate. But you know, you step back from it and you kind of go, respect, kind of space, you know. And when people calm down, they realize they're saying the same thing, you know. So it's about, again, living the values as well as coming up with them. So that's the only.
I actually think that it's really interesting. It was great. So one of the things that I know we discussed, you both do training, and you both are teachers lecturing in ethics in various different arenas. And I pointed out that once I understood it, I was like, how is nobody teaching us this in school? Like I mean, this is like, so would either of you have any thoughts on, you know, how to start weaving more? Because as the world becomes more fragmented, as well, hopefully it's going both ways, but I mean, we are becoming more individualistic. So as Níall says, that move from relying on the law for groups, like the next step is to have individuals who understand their ethical responsibilities. So do you have any, very, very broad for this hour of the morning, but Níall, do you have any thoughts on that?
In terms of how it should be made in schools, Sharon, is that the question?
Well, more about, I suppose, how can we, like, we're talking about, I suppose you're here for leaders and ethics, and I suppose it's not, no, I don't think I've never seen on a CV, you know, I understand my ethical principles, do you know what I mean? But it's something that we actually expect from leaders. So what are ways that we can actually encourage this language into spaces so that people are actually, it's accepted, that it's not some sort of fluffy, you know, oh, he's an ethical guy, but that it is actually like a fundamental principle.
Yeah, I guess you've got to act within your sphere of influence. That's we're all limited to that, aren't we? So It's whatever is within your sphere of influence, whatever level you are in an organization, be you the CEO, be you on the board or the chair, or whatever level of the organization, you act within your sphere of influence. And I think that's all you can do there is to encourage it to happen. So, you know,
But
if you hold the
maybe
pen
how
on the
do you
policies, that
how
gives you
could you
more
develop
influence.
how could
Mm.
you develop your understanding of when, because I think you said it there that most ethical conundrums are that people don't have the time to actually unpick to actually recognize that they're in an ethical dilemma, I think was the exact words that you used. So I
Yeah.
suppose, how is there ways leaders could actually make the time? Is there something they could do? Is there, you know, steps that they could take?
Yeah, reflection. I just asked the question. I don't know if you're taking a roll call of everybody on this webinar right now, but that's you all taking time out of your day to come here and listen to talks about ethical leadership. You're getting 3 perspectives here, just 3. And when you go into your breakout rooms, you'll get a lot more perspectives. So I think it's as simple as that. It's not hard study. It's not technical. You kind of, as I say to people sometimes, sometimes people know their values. They kind of know what they stand for, their confidence there, but not everybody's like that. Some people know it when they see it. Some people don't realize it until they do it. So we all kind of operate with different things. I don't know if there was very briefly, there was a study done by Harvard and MIT about when people act more ethical or less ethical, and it linked it back to the circadian rhythm, and whether you're a morning person or a night owl. And the morning person, obviously, they wake up in the morning, they're full of beans, they're very ethical up until a certain point of the day, and then their ethics starts to drop. And then the night owl is the opposite. They wake up in the morning, they're not very ethical, but they get more ethical as the day goes on. There's all sorts of studies like that and theories. But at the end of the day, I think it's reflecting and engaging with it and allowing time to actually think about it. And that's not hard study. That can be on the train on the way home, you know.
It's not, but it's also something that's probably not encouraged very much, which is why it's such a great conversation to have this morning. Jane Ann, any
Yeah, I
thoughts?
just say, and there's a comment there in the chat that I agree with, because when I was writing my notes, I was like, you know, what can we learn from humanitarian organizations about ethical leadership? And it's a bit similar to a comment there about what we can actually learn from non-profit organizations around ethical leadership. And actually it's about how we can actually communicate that more broadly beyond our own sector, because it's quite fundamental to actually a lot of the decision making that actually happens within the sector. And I think it's actually about that confidence piece, you know, that we are always coming from that social equality perspective, that, you know, should be kind of part of all of our organizations, you know, mandates. And therefore our starting point is quite different to kind of, let's say, in the private sector, and actually being confident in the fact that actually we are, you know, although we might not talk in this kind of language around ethical leadership and things like that, but actually we're kind of demonstrating it a lot in our work. And I think it's interesting because, like, I do some lecturing in global responsible leadership in Smurfit, and they're all business, you know, students. So it's completely, you know, it's quite a stretch for them to bring into kind of what are some of the ethical decisions that you make in kind of high conflict areas. And I think, though, there is an appetite for it, and it's about looking within our own networks. Where is there an opportunity to actually influence and step out within our kind of, you know, within our networks to say, actually, this is where we can be more ethical. This is where we can actually demonstrate better leadership, or this is actually how we do it. And I think there's an opportunity, whether in universities, in schools, or otherwise, that we can actually bring this a bit more to the fore. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like studies are showing like that the next generation, they more aligned with purpose. They want to understand values and vision and stuff. And actually, when I first met you, Níall, it was to talk about ESG and how we thought it might impact leaders in the sector. And you pointed out that the nature of it meant that most people in the sector were actually already acting in a way that this wasn't new for our sector, that it was other sectors that were going to have to line up with it.
Yeah, and that my earlier comment was that, that there's no greater sector in Ireland that's having as big a social impact as the charity non-profit sector, and now the private sector is running to catch up with that. And I listen, there might be opportunities there, and in terms of alignment and in seeking new donors, etc. But it is, and I'm seeing it in the corporate world because of sustainability, so the environment, the social, and the governance. But on the social side, like it's back to that business case again. You're now having, you know, for example, we'll stick with the environment. Actually, it's because it's a more readily available example for me. When you're putting through a request for capital, you talk about the return on investment and the time it'll take, etc., 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 all that usual finance stuff. But then you actually also, well, what's the carbon emissions? What will this reduce? Will this increase? Then it talks about the impact on people in terms of the time it will take, the resources we have to do it. So business cases are becoming more considerate, if you like, of other factors. And to your point there, Jane Ann, about it's moving away. Your business students are very much moving away from that kind of shareholder primacy kind of. It's about maximizing return on capital, kind of more stakeholder approach of kind of it's not just about financial capital, social capital, environmental capital as well matters. You've been in that space for decades. It is always about social capital for you. And for those of your charities that are dedicated to environmental issues, but being environmental capital. Financial capital for you was get enough in to do what you have to do to achieve return on social capital. So again, I think you're out of the stalls a lot earlier than the private sector on this.
Love it. We're coming up on time. It flew. Do you have people usually remember one last thing that they love to say? Jane Ann, do you have any kind of closing guidance? And we were very conscious we didn't call you experts in ethics because of the fact that it's literally such a personal topic. But do you have any closing thoughts, guys?
Sharon, sorry, I have a little fella coming in here. One sec.
Yeah, no bother, Níall.
It's fine. It's actually what Níall called me out on when I was saying about what as individual organizations you can do, and looking back at kind of, you know, how you find your principles and values, and looking and doing an exercise around how you're actually demonstrating those in practice. And, you know, it is that broader stakeholder engagement piece. And it's interesting sometimes when I do an exercise with the master's students in terms of, you know, addressing a challenge or a problem, the last stakeholder they mention is the patients, you know, and actually that should be the first. So it's really around that, ensuring that, you know, that the people that you're supporting, individuals or communities, that they are kind of front and center, I think, of kind of, you know, your approach and are guiding you really in terms of what is needed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know exactly. It's nearly so implicit. You actually nearly kind of forget to to make it explicit. Great. Níall, any closing remarks? Are you okay there? Does he want to join in?
He's calling like mad, and the door was kind of slightly ajar, so he was letting himself in. So, sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought. So,
any closing remarks for our sector and ethical leadership?
Yeah, listen, the people are in the room, aren't they? So you start with yourselves. Ethics is about you. So start there. It's not about other people. So start there. Work within your spheres of influences, your networks, as Jane Ann pointed out, and start influencing and allow time. Sometimes the easiest thing to do is at the end of a meeting or at the end of a decision is just allow 5 or 10 minutes to reflect and kind of go, is there anything we'd have done different there? And, you know, is there anything that's bothering somebody? Is just ask those questions. Anybody got any concerns? Doesn't matter how bizarre it is. Those simple little questions just make people feel comfortable to say something. And that starts the conversation.
I think that even in itself, you know, if boards were to include like a 5-minute kind of like ethical reflection, do we feel like has everybody had enough time? Things like that are so practical. It's been a phenomenal conversation. We always ask, because it's the topic of leadership, what has been your best piece of leadership advice to date? It's usually very funny, but who'd like to go first?
Well, I have to think about that one for a second.
Oh, do you have to? Sorry. Thought we'd ask you. Níall, do you have yours?
Can you repeat that again, Sharon? Sorry.
What's the best piece of leadership advice that you got on your way that you feel is worth passing on?
Slow down and let the wisdom flow.
Oh, you're all about the time, aren't you? Yeah. Okay.
I would say, I'm not sure if someone said this to me, maybe it's a reflection over time, is that you are an expert in your area. Nobody has the same perspective as you. So that's absolutely critical. And it's just key to kind of having confidence in terms of courageous leadership and being able to kind of having the confidence to move forward. I think it's really that nobody has the same level of expertise as you, because
Yeah.
you've come with your own experience, your own or expertise and everything. So yeah.
I love that. That's fantastic. Listen, thank you so much. So what we're going to do now is pop everyone into breakout rooms, and so there'll be a facilitator there to have a little bit of a chat. And then as you go, if you pop questions in the Q&A box, we'll actually bring everybody back and we'll have some time to take some questions at the end. Thank you so much, Jane Ann and Níall. That was amazing. I could talk about it all day, and you're both so knowledgeable in the area, so we really appreciate your time.
Oh, great. It's been a great discussion. Looking forward to further discussion now on it. But thanks very much, Sharon.
No problem at all. We'll just pop these into breakout rooms now. If you have any problems, just drop chats to Perrine or Matthew. That awkward silence while they put us into breakout rooms. How deep? Oh, now they're recording. Janie, that got deep in our room. Anyway, I've got some great questions I know from our room for Níall and Jane Ann, because you were going to fix it, aren't you? Are they back? Hold on, I think they're
Not yet. We are waiting for them for everyone to join back in. Yeah.
Okay, they're obviously having a great time. Please, if you have any questions from your room to throw at Níall and Jane Ann, throw them in the Q&A. We have some questions after coming through. So here's Jane Ann back now as well. And hopefully we should have Níall back now in a second.
I'm here.
Are you here? Sorry.
am.
There he is. Fantastic. We were just saying those rooms got deep. Some really good conversations, and I have some questions for you, you lucky devils. I'm going to go straight to the first one. Money and ethics. How do we balance the choice between funding and ethics? And there was an example of like the alcohol companies trying to sponsor, and any advice or pointers for making those decisions, or having the decision made before the decision has to be made?
Yeah, I could speak a bit to that, because when particularly in my time with MSF, we made very hard, let's say, decisions around funding based on principles. So we during my time, we actually rejected all EU and Irish funding, government funding, which still stands today, for the EU's position on migrants in the Mediterranean, and the policies of deterrence rather than from a humanitarian perspective. So I think that was really, that's an extreme example, let's say, of,
How much
adhering
kind of
to your
money?
principles of, that you do not want to accept funding from a party that you feel is actually going against your values and principles. And that, that had an enormous impact on both the Irish office, but also on MSF globally. But it's sometimes actually when you uphold kind of the principles of your organization and you stand by that kind of level of integrity and how you demonstrate that integrity, it also could be quite valuable to other donors. So it's just to mention that I think that when sometimes and there's also like corporate policies around accepting funding from different companies and things like that, and I think it has to be looked at a case by case basis, obviously within different organizations. But it also again can be quite powerful when you are looking for funding to say, actually, we don't take this funding from this group because we believe they're not really they have a particular agenda, and that's not something that we want to endorse.
You're not talking a couple of €1,000 there, are you?
No, there's millions. So
wow,
it was really it's kind of and trying to make sure, I think that's where it feeds into the independence piece. Is the organization, company, donor, are they trying to influence your interests? Are they trying to perhaps also present themselves as better through compromising your organization by associating with you? And I think there's a lot to be considered. I'm sorry, I shouldn't talk too much, but I think there's a lot to be considered about, you know, not knowing the value of your brand and knowing that actually you're not going to compromise your brand by association, because there's a lot of positivity being associated with nonprofits and charities. And I think it's really understanding that value of your organization and sticking by your principles in that regard, and ensuring you're.
Just for clarity, it wasn't Dóchas, it was MSF.
It was
Just
MSF,
yeah. No, just somebody
we
popped
have
in
other
the
policies
comments.
here in terms of accepting funding and different things, but we do still receive Irish Aid funding.
Yes, no, that's perfect. It was just somebody, I think somebody had mixed them up. Níall, I'm going to give you a different question, actually, if you don't mind. There's a question about when an ethical mistake is made by an organization, like how do you learn from that? What do you do with it? How do you move forward from it?
You learn from it. Actually, in our group, we were actually talking about that, and I was actually transparently declaring a mistake we made and how we learned from it in relation to the use of a photograph. Yeah, that's it. You learn from it. I think ethics has, you know, you have to allow for failure. People don't always get it right. Bearing in mind, we talk about this lovely thing called time and making time for things. But the reality is, in a lot of cases, people make decisions very, very, very quickly. And then if something goes wrong, they are analysed, and the analysis happens with lots of time, whereas the decision was made in a second. So it's kind of like the TMO on the rugby match, watching something in slow motion, and you see something wrong. It's easy to see it wrong in that way, but it's not easy to see it happening in real time. So yeah, what's important though is to admit the mistake, to embrace it, learn from it, and share that learnings, and go back and take whatever action. What is it we should have done differently to avoid that? I will just caveat though, it's not always easy. Given what I do for a living, I do come across ethical dilemmas that just are not salvageable. So that does happen, folks. It doesn't always end rosy. Asher, we'll all hug and kiss and make up, and we'll learn from this. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes the values, the clashes are just so great that it's boom, there's a chasm, and there forever will be, and people go their separate ways. That does happen. I've seen that happen at every level. I've seen that happen in boards where differences have been such that we can't tolerate each other on the board anymore, so one of them goes, you know. Same in organizations. So just remember, it's not always rosy. But I think when it's all settled, it's no harm for someone to revisit that, possibly not straight away. Give it some time. Again, here's this time, and to revisit it and kind of go, right, what could be done differently there, if anything. Sometimes nothing else you might have been able to do anything different.
Yeah. Look, I get that. We're actually out of time. I just have a couple of, and time being the big, I think time was one of the things that came up in our room and that people talked about, and it's probably not the thing people thought we would hit, you know, was taking the time to reflect and to think. And a few people mentioned that would be the thing going back, and we had one chair in our room actually who mentioned the round table space at the end of a board meeting for people to have a think, and also their board have a 2 to 3 minute silence after every major decision, just to actually sit with the decision to make sure that there's no because somebody said sometimes the silent low voice is the one that people should be listening to. And I think it's hard to know how to resource yourself for things like time. And I know a piece of feedback that we're very proud of with the Breakfast Club was one member told us that the Breakfast Clubs were their time to actually reflect on where they were and what they were doing. So please use us as a resource, and you know, they're regular and they're a great way to meet new people and to hear different ways of doing things. We're always looking for speakers and topics. As you can see, Jane Ann and Níall come from very different backgrounds, but ended up pretty much at the same place. But we're always interested in hearing what you want to hear from people on the Breakfast Club. And just to say, our next event will be going live. You'll get the details of it in the thank you, and it's going to be on the 11th of April. It's in person in Dublin in Salesforce Tower, which is its actual name, and it's on leadership and making change. And our speakers will be our own director, Colette Bennett, and also Alva Smith, and they're going to have an amazing conversation about ways to make change. So I'm not going to keep you any longer. I have 1 minute left to say thank you so much to Jane Ann, McKenna and Níall Fitzgerald. It was a really interesting conversation. I know from listening in our room, people took a lot from it. We will send out their details and we will send out the resources that were referenced throughout. Jane Ann has actually put in the article I saw there about medicine. So you had that handy, obviously. There was a lot of conversation about that one, I would say.
Exactly. It's a quick Google that comes right up. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate it and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Bill.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks to the wheel. Yeah.
Okay, all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.